And welcome to the latest in this series of RES webinars focusing on the economic issues and policy solutions to the Covid-19 crisis. I'm Richard Davis. I'm going to be acting as the chair of the meeting today, and our topic is the local economic impacts of Covid-19. It's a really timely one. This morning's papers and radio were full of references to a speech and visit by the Prime Minister, which it seems he was backing the importance of a centralised, UK-wide approach to this pandemic. This in itself is interesting, since the backdrop for our discussion is a set of regional inequalities of employment, of income, productivity, of wages that predate the pandemic and have led to the so-called levelling up agenda, the idea that regional policies and regional solutions may be important. So there are some really big questions for us today. How does regional economic performance look in the UK? How is it being changed by the COVID-19 crisis? And what can be done about it? Joining me to discuss are three economists, all of whom take a really big interest in the UK's regional economic performance. Our first presentation will be from Helen Simpson, a professor at Bristol University and also director of the Centre for Evidence-Based Policy Studies. We'll then hear from Philip McCann, professor at Sheffield University and also a fellow in the Department of Land Economy at Cambridge. And the discussion will lead off with thoughts from Henry Overman, a professor at the Centre of Economic Performance based at the LSE and also director of the What Works Centre for Local Economic Growth. Now, please do send in your questions and send them in early, send them in now. I'm sure people have burning questions about regional economic performance, and the way to send those in is to use the email address webinar@res.org.uk. And we look forward to answering them. So without further ado, I will hand over to Helen.
Thank you, Richard. I will just try and share my screen with you if I can. Okay, hopefully that works. So I'm just going to start off this session by setting the scene a little bit. And I will start by thinking about where we were before the pandemic. So we know that there are very long-term differences across the UK in a wide range of outcomes, so economic outcomes, health, educational outcomes. And we know that these manifest themselves both across regions, so the North-South divide, within regions between urban and rural areas, and even within cities. And as Richard said at the beginning, you can pretty much pick your measure to illustrate these differences, so productivity or wages or unemployment. So what this map is showing you is a measure of the intensity of deprivation across local authorities in the UK. Now, this is an index measure which encompasses a whole range of indicators from income, unemployment, education, health, even things like housing. Darker areas on this map indicate local authorities with a higher intensity of deprivation. And what you can see is that many of these darker areas in the north, but also something that we might return to, many of these darker shaded areas are actually in coastal local authorities, for example, in the east and southwest of England. So what are the reasons behind this? Why were we in this position before the pandemic? So at least since the 1980s, we've seen big changes in the composition of industries across the UK, which have hit places highly unevenly. So we've seen lots of manufacturing jobs lost in some particular areas of the country, and we've seen both high skill and lower skill service sector jobs created in other areas of the country. So why this has happened is due to the phenomenon that high skill workers and the employers that want to hire those workers derive benefits from clustering together in the same locations. So in particular, in this case, in London. And we've seen that people are still willing to pay very high housing costs to live in London and to access those job opportunities and those amenities. And in fact, many of the disparities across geographic space that we've mentioned so far are actually driven by the distribution of highly skilled workers across the UK. So what are the implications of this? So we know that if some people are unable to move or unwilling to move, this creates huge disparities in access to job opportunities across the country. And as we've seen as a result of the Brexit vote, this is creating political as well as economic divides across geographic space. So where are we now? I think it's becoming fairly clear, if not very clear, that these existing geographic inequalities are likely to be made worse by the pandemic. We've seen that the health, potentially the education and economic effects of the pandemic are going to hit places unevenly. For example, the ONS has released figures which showed us first something that we already knew, that age-adjusted mortality rates are much higher in more deprived areas of the country relative to less deprived areas. But also, if you look at the distribution of COVID-19 deaths, this has really amplified these disparities between the most deprived areas and less deprived areas. So in starting to think about economic impacts, we could begin to think about what is the potential impact going to be on jobs. And to do this, we could look at the data that's been produced on workers who've been furloughed. We might think that these workers are the ones at the most risk of losing their jobs. So we've seen that about 9 million workers have been furloughed, and about a third of these have been in what are already low-paying sectors, such as retail, accommodation, and food services. So again, there are sectoral implications here which are going to have effects on different areas of the country. So what I've done in this figure is plot differences in the percentage of employees who have been furloughed across different areas. With, again, darker shaded areas, local authorities indicating a higher incidence of employees being furloughed. And you can see again that this is highlighting some areas in the north, also some areas in the Midlands, and also quite clearly some coastal areas in the southwest of England. Now, to illustrate the fact that this is also a sectoral phenomenon, so some of the very highest areas on this measure are around Gatwick and Heathrow, so clearly areas where lots of people are employed in the airline industry. But again, you can see the sectoral effects in these coastal areas which are heavily reliant on tourism. So in terms of thinking more about this, what I've done in the next few figures that I'm going to show you is essentially correlate these measures with some other indicators which tell us something about these areas. So in this graph, I'm showing you that more deprived areas, so they were already indicated as more deprived on the deprivation index measure, and also areas with higher pre-existing unemployment had a higher percentage of workers furloughed. So the vertical axis on this graph is showing you the percentage of employees who were furloughed, and the horizontal axis is showing you the deprivation index score for each local authority, with a higher number indicating a more deprived area. And I've just picked out a couple here. So Blackpool, I've highlighted, this is the area with the highest deprivation score, and as you can see, it has a pretty high fraction of its workforce furloughed. Camden here is the area with the lowest fraction of its workforce furloughed on my calculations, and a number of those other dots at the bottom are very affluent areas within London and also other affluent areas in the southeast, such as Cambridge. Now another graph which is showing you that low wage areas, so areas which had pre-existing low wages, have also seen a higher percentage of their workforce furloughed. So again, Camden is down there with relatively high average weekly earnings and has a low fraction of the workforce furloughed. But what I want to emphasize again is that in part this is due to the sectoral and occupational distribution of jobs. So this final chart that I'm going to show you is my best attempt to sort of capture this. So what I've plotted on the horizontal axis here is the fraction of people who are employed in managerial, professional and technical roles. And I'm thinking of those as the roles where it is easiest for you as an employee to potentially work from home and avoid being furloughed. And therefore you might think you're at a much lower risk of job loss over the next 6 to 12 months. And again, you can see very clearly that a much lower percentage of the workforce are furloughed in locations where a higher fraction of the workforce are employed in these roles. So finally, turning to the policy response. One way to think about this is to think about which industries and places are going to be best able to recover. But before we can really do that, there are still some very big unanswered questions about how the pandemic is actually going to change our behaviour, and questions which are relevant for the regional impacts of the pandemic. So will the pandemic change our attitudes towards mobility in general, towards commuting and to home working? I think it's unlikely that the pandemic will lead to an increase in daily commuting relative to the position where we were before the pandemic struck. How will it affect our attitudes towards online spending versus very local spending where we live? Well, again, it's unlikely that online spending is going to go down relative to where we were at the beginning. And also, will the pandemic bring about changes to the way that firms are organised and how they think about their supply chains? Here, I think that Brexit might play a bigger role, but it is something to bear in mind. I think as a general point, it's highly likely that those places that are hit less hard economically are going to be better able to recover. It seems very likely that London will weather the storm better than some other locations. So should the policy response be a national policy response? Should it be sectoral? Should it be place-based? I think we can decompose the policy response into short-term policy responses. So first of all, the furlough scheme has been a national policy response. You can see the Chancellor now thinking a little bit more about a sectoral policy response, in the sense that he has put in very targeted VAT cuts affecting some of those sectors of the economy that he thinks are going to be badly hit. In the medium and longer term, we want to think about policies that enable people to move back into jobs and addressing some of these deep underlying inequalities in health and educational outcomes. And here I think a national, or potentially there is more of a case for a place-based policy response. As a brief aside, I just want to mention quickly what we have typically thought about as a place-based policy. So economists who evaluate these type of policy have typically thought about some sort of spatially targeted employment subsidy program or an enterprise zone. And the aim of these types of policies is at improving the economic performance of a specific location by creating jobs and raising wages. And we want to help those disadvantaged residents in those locations. The concerns economists typically have with these type of policies is that they might induce very local movements of either businesses or people who want to take advantage of the subsidy or tax break. And so this can be highly inefficient and might also bring into question who ultimately benefits from the policy. Are we actually generating new businesses, or are we simply moving them around? And are we generating new employment for the original residents of these locations? I think now, though, we think about place-based policy a lot more broadly. We start to think about where we might place public spending, where we might place public investment in things such as education, transport, amenities and housing. And in doing this, we're not really worrying so much about micro movements of businesses and people. We might actually, by doing this, try and induce some quite large scale spatial movements of people, thinking about moving high skilled people away from London to other areas of the country. So just to conclude then, has the pandemic brought about a need for a change in our approach here? I think the structural problems that the pandemic has highlighted are still very much the same problems. it is very likely that they're going to become further entrenched. And it's also the case that the pandemic has really once again highlighted the interactions between many of these outcomes: poor quality housing, health, poor health outcomes, and poor economic outcomes. So is there a need for a place-based policy? Potentially, yes. I think if we want to solve some of these deep problems, we might want to think about looking again about how infrastructure investment and public spending is distributed geographically across the country. And we might want to think again about how we value the effects of public spending in one location versus another. It's quite easy to justify investment in London on the basis that the returns might be very high or the highest in the country, but is that necessarily what we want to prioritize? And should we start to build in other sort of strategic aims, such as potential nationwide gains to current and future generations from less inequality, and in addition, less spatial inequality? So I will stop there and hand briefly back to Richard.
Thank you very much, Helen. That was really interesting. I'm just very briefly going to share my screen, which I hope you can now see. I was really struck by your map of the geographic extent of the furlough scheme. I think you had the whole of Dorset, the whole of Cornwall, and pretty much all of South Devon with the highest rates of furlough. This is, and I had a question about the coastline, which we'll defer to the end, but I wanted to raise it now. This is a map that I put together with Anna Valero at the CEP, and it shows UK productivity and German productivity. Red is lower productivity, blue is better productivity, and you know the big picture, and this chart got retweeted loads of times, is that UK is just so much further behind Germany. But one of the things I've been troubled about since doing this is the sort of inaccuracy when you look at countries like this, because, and it's a really simple point, but important given your presentation, all of the stuff around us is sea. And this picture of Germany is in a sense a bit inaccurate because, you know, down in the bottom corner, you've got, I think it's Munich down there, you've got Austria just there and you've got France just here. So my question when we come to the discussion at the end is there anything that can be done really about the fact that having such a big coastline, which means that places, for example, in Cornwall or in South Devon, you're not really ever going to want to put a large logistics centre, say, there because it's so far from everywhere else, suddenly becomes a structural problem and also potentially the kind of structural problem we can't get past. So I hope that's something, the economics of the British coast, I guess, is what I'm saying, is something I hope we can pick up in discussion. But I will now hand over to Philip, who's going to give us his presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, and thank you for Helen. I'm just getting my screen up. Just hold on a moment, just so I can share my slides with everybody. Here we go. So I'm going to talk about these things from a different angle to Helen. I'm not going to show any data, for example, in thematic terms, trying to explain the mechanisms of what I think is happening or what's going to happen, but also in the context of what has been happening over recent years and recent decades. So the levelling up agenda is based in a complicated set of problems. It's a set of problems that I talk about in terms of interregional inequalities, firstly by arguing that they're very high by international standards. There's many people who haven't really understood that, have argued that that's not true, that we look like most other countries. I've spent a lot of time trying to demonstrate that that's not the case. And there are many people out there who are aware of these issues, saying actually interregional inequalities in the UK are very, very high by international standards. At least in comparison to other large countries, we are the most unequal country in the industrialised world. And the key features that these inequalities are over very, very short distances. The UK economy is only, it's smaller than the size of the US state of Wyoming. And there's certain characteristics of this. So if you think about the core of the economy, approximately from Norwich down to Bristol, down to Bournemouth, and then back over, including all of the rest of the southeast of London, also places like Milton Keynes, Cambridge, Oxford, and so on. Those parts of the economy basically perform very well on most indicators. And those areas of the economy are specialized particularly in what we call the production of tradables, so goods which and services which can be traded interregionally, but more importantly internationally. Whereas the rest of the country outside of that core, there's increased partitioning into the production of non-tradables, goods and services for local consumption. But that's a big, from an economic point of view, this is a big problem, because it means the growth prospects of a big part of the economy are very hampered. And why are we in this situation? Well, it's a long-term process over many decades, but it's the interaction of what I call the 3 Gs: geography, globalization, and governance. And often people say, well, can you tell me what the reason is? Can you tell, is it to do with skills, or is it to do with infrastructure? And I say, well, actually, it's not about any of them in particular. It's about how they interact. It's a lot of things taking place at the same time, and how these interactions take place also changes over time. But importantly, it's also about perceptions, because perceptions are about governance as much as anything. And our own understanding of the situation we're in, I argue, is very, very weak, and has been very weak for a long time. Now there is a shift in terms of how we think about these things, but there's still a long way to go. And what's the basic problem? Well, we have an ultra-centralized, top-down, and almost entirely space-blind governance system. Our levels of subnational autonomy in the UK are equivalent to countries like Albania and Moldova. And in this very, very top-down, centralized, and overwhelmingly space-blind governance system is uniquely ill-equipped, badly designed, mismatched, in order to respond to the internal inequalities, which are the productivity and prosperity challenges that we face today. And I've written a lot about these in other areas, and here I'll give you a couple of examples. Now, the debates about these things wax and wane. If I go back to 2012, 2013, there were some very interesting pieces in The Spectator, where this image is from, and also The Economist, who were arguing that these inequalities are very profound, and they have very profound consequences in terms of society. But as I say, these things are wax and waned, and then after a while, people sort of lose interest in them and talk about other things. It's not so much, it's not too big, or it's not so important. But of course, in the last year or two, narratives have shifted dramatically, and even in recent months, our narratives now, we've moved from rebalancing to leveling up, and these things have become much more center stage. Why is that? I would argue it's primarily because of the political shocks, particularly related to Brexit. If you look on the horizontal axis here, what you see is the proportion of people that voted leave in any local area. These are NUTS 2 regions of the UK. And on the vertical axis is the proportion of the local economy in terms of GDP, which is directly dependent on demand, consumption demand, and investment demand in the rest of Europe. And what you see is the places that voted leave are more dependent on European markets than the places voted remain. Actually, London is the dot in the bottom left-hand corner. Strong vote to remain, but very little dependence on the rest of Europe because it's so globalized. So this is potentially a profound geographical regional shock, but it's resulted in a political decision which is very profound. But is it really in the best interest of these places? Well, the Brexit vote was described as being the right answer to the wrong question by a former chief executive of one of the large city regions in the UK. And I think that's the best description of what was going on. But why is this happening? Well, it's in a sense, as Paul Collier talks about, it's the notion of a mutiny. These political shocks reflect a geography of discontent where people are basically unhappy with the livelihoods and the lives in their localities because they see that they are, in many ways, being left behind. They know that. They can see it very clearly, and they can see where their benchmarks, what the comparisons are in the UK. They're very, very close. And the other places they're looking at have a kind of levels of prosperity which are simply beyond the reach, or it appears to be, to people in these other areas. Now, this notion of geography of discontent has been used in many other countries, also by the OECD and other places. I actually coined the phrase originally. Brookings program in the United States use it widely at the moment. And the point is that when you look at the emerging economic geography of differences in terms of productivity across countries and within countries, actually they very closely map onto the political voting of these anti-establishment type of populist votes. We tend to borrow narratives a lot. When we're thinking about this issue about perceptions, cities versus towns, metropolitan elites versus the rest, actually, in the UK, these arguments are not correct, at least in terms of the economic arguments. So for many years, actually, the question about, well, does the UK have a regional problem? There were many people for many years said, no, it doesn't. We just look like anywhere else. And then over time, you start to get a response, well, there is a bit of a problem, but there's not much we can do about it. It's a natural outcome of agglomeration forces. And then other people say, well, after a while, well, maybe there is a problem and it is an issue, but there's not much we can do about it. Other things are more important to deal with, and so on. It's only very recently we've actually got to a point where, yes, this is big, it's a real problem, we have to do something about it, but almost the question is, has the horse already bolted? Because the question now is, can we do something about it, or is it too late? And part of the problem in terms of perceptions is for many years there's been a profound lack of awareness of these issues in terms of national media. Thought leaders, thought influencers, thought shapers, think tanks, consultancies, academic institutions, and how they interact with all arms of government. In other words, the real governance issue. Why? Because those people are looking at the UK through the lens of their 24/7 experience, which is living in and around the London area. But the problem is that that's not representative at all of the rest of the country. So we have national debates which are very, very skewed and therefore don't really reflect the realities as they are on the ground. And this is where this reaction comes from. And the best description is Andy Haldane, talks about the UK economy as being a hub with no spokes. We do have all these discussions about metropolitan elites in the political arena. I actually don't agree with these discussions. And I accept to the extent that we're talking about governance centralization. Then the argument, there's a lot of credence in the argument, but it's not about urbanization. It's not about cities versus rural areas. It's not about cities versus towns, urban versus rural. These are narratives which are borrowed from the United States, and they're not correct in the UK. It doesn't look like that. But the point is, we do have big interregional inequalities over very short distances. The levelling up was starting to think about addressing. And now we've had these enormous shocks to do with coronavirus. We have these enormous sectoral shocks to do with things like automotive, tourism, hospitality. Obviously, there's going to be shocks in terms of the graduate and school leaver markets, real challenges around the high street. But as we move into this, out of the extraordinary phase, so we're in the ordinary phase, normal risk return profiles, into an extraordinary phase where we can't price things, and then we move out to some sort of new normal again. The problem is that investors' expectations are very weakly grounded. There's no consensus regarding the speed or the nature of the path of recovery. Some people talk about a V-shaped response, a W-shaped, a Z-shaped, a Nike swoosh type, shaped, U-shaped, L-shaped. We don't know, and this is part of the problem also because of the fear of further pandemic spikes in the medium term. All we know is that the scale of scarring does depend on the time it's going to take to roll out properly a vaccine. But there are some things we do know at this point which are likely. One, there's going to be much bigger government debt and deficits, we know, but also government ownership in some sense of many key parts of the economy. So there's an increased power and role of national governments, and we don't know what is the speed and the scale of any fiscal retrenchment. And we don't know about the willingness of the markets in the medium and the long term to lend to governments because this is a new situation. We know that there will be some sort of nearshoring in terms of global value chains, GBCs, maybe associated with some sort of increased automation around 3D printing, artificial intelligence use, possibly because they can get around a lot of the issues in terms of social distancing. Previous recessions have generally been periods when we've seen increased productivity, but that was not in the last crisis, the 2008 crisis, and I'm not sure there's any obvious reason why that should be the case in this crisis. But moving from the normal to extraordinary, and then back to some sort of normal, is transitioning through the Knightian notion of radical uncertainty. And what do I think the key issues are here? One is that the yield spreads between all asset classes and also within asset classes are rising. They have risen and they're rising. And that will lead to profound capital reallocation shocks. So that will affect all forms of credit, lending, borrowing, and huge restructuring in the money in the asset markets. Apart from the big five big tech companies, there's not going to be many winners, if we can talk about winners at all in this crisis, apart from certain areas of the private equity industry and some hedge funds. But in general, what do I think is going to be the effect of these changes, these capital shocks? One is a movement towards greater concentration of monopoly positions in many, many industries because of the scale of the shakeout. And here there's a problem, particularly for the SME industry, small and medium-sized enterprises, which are extremely important for driving local economies, will be facing severe problems in terms of cutbacks of credit availability. They're squeezed from above because many of the bigger companies that previously were investment grade are now looking for bank funding, drawing on de jure unlimited access to credit that previously de facto they never used because they would always go through the money market. Now those companies are looking for credit from banks. On the bottom, from kind of bottom upwards, the SMEs are going to be squeezed because of the general clawback in terms of capital, and also a reversal of many venture capital markets, which will basically consolidate only in safer places. So many SMEs will be squeezed, and in particular, the most innovative SMEs, which are the ones which are always at the back of the queue. We know that from a lot of econometric evidence. It's easier for a bank to understand what a hairdresser does than a new tech entrepreneur. It's much more difficult, it's more risky. And the other area, apart from SMEs, which I think are going to be really heavily impacted, are local real estate markets, in particular focusing on commercial markets. Urban redevelopment is such a central aspect of the attempted regeneration of a lot of our cities. Rebuilding infrastructure, land reclamation, repurposing land for different activities, new office facilities, new retail, and so on. The inability to value assets. Real estate investment trusts actually closed for several months. They were. It's very, very difficult to value things suddenly, and there'll be therefore a shift towards land banking rather than development. And the yields which are going to rise the most in the most riskiest contexts, in terms of the most riskiest sectors, and in the places which are the most risky. So the kind of big complex urban redevelopments of the type I'm talking about in weaker economies, weaker regions, it seems to me that they're going to be right in the eye of the storm. So the yield curve between the weaker and the stronger places, I think, is going to get bigger. What do I think in terms of geographical terms? That will lead to further divergence. Exactly the same thing happened in the 2008 crisis. Broadly, we saw patterns of interregional convergence in many countries that overnight went to interregional divergence. I think the same thing will worsen the existing divergence problems we have. In addition, when you think about greater centralization because of greater involvement of central government in the economy, and also greater monopoly positions within the economy because of all the shakeout, all of these things point towards greater interregional divergence. And we saw that in terms of the comments of Helen earlier on, the ability to telework, different types of occupations where people can work from home, they can just interact face-to-face on a less frequent basis because they can substitute for these other activities. Those types of managerial face-to-face activities that can be done through telework, those types of things are more based in certain parts of the country, the more prosperous parts of the country. So again, all of these seem to me to be pointing in the same direction. There will be some long-term reduction in commuting, but not for very high value activities, which are really built on tacit information. That's not going to change. But interestingly, that this could widen the hinterland of the prosperous cities, places like Edinburgh, Bristol, particularly London. Why do I think that? Because instead of having to work either at home or 5 days a week commuting into London, the possibility now becomes, well, I could work at home for 2 or 3 days a week and work in London 2 or 3 days a week. The attractiveness of actually commuting in and out of London actually becomes greater from greater distances now. It becomes more possible in terms of the work-life balance and how you organize things. So people who would previously be looking at employment opportunities in other parts of the country may well actually become more attracted towards opportunities in the more prosperous cities. And of course, the same argument would work against the weaker cities. We know that there's going to be high street retail shops, and they will be particularly severe in the weaker economies. And there's also specific things, of course, around university cities. One of the things I think is a real problem will be the movement towards the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreements. My guess is these will probably be put back by about 5 years because the focus will all be overwhelmingly on just trying to get people back in jobs. And on the final point, just the final 2 slides, in terms of the policy arena, there's often this debate in the UK about people-based versus place-based. I'm very clear when I speak publicly. I think this is a false dichotomy. It's about people in places. This kind of way of thinking doesn't help us. It's a false trade-off. And the people sorting narrative, I think, is given too much weighting in the UK. People sorting, the clustering of similar groups in terms of skills and profiles in certain areas. Well, we know that this is part of the economy. That's absolutely true, but it's not the reason fundamentally for why the economy diverged. But these things do become cumulative over time. Of course, that's absolutely correct. But fundamentally, we need to think about the local place-based development traps. And here, institutional reform is absolutely critical. So we have to think about real devolution, which is comprehensive, goes across all issues, provides real power for the decision makers at the local levels. Think about questions around incentives. We need underlying fiscal stabilizers also to facilitate financial devolution. But basically, we need a very profound rethink of the relationship between national and subnational in all areas of governance, particularly regarding the financial aspects here. Because we are facing a perfect storm, the combination of Brexit and COVID-19 is going to make levelling up even worse. Each of those elements, COVID-19 and Brexit, works against levelling up in their own right. The combination of the two is going to make this even more difficult than before. And scale matters. If we're going to devolve, which I can't see any alternative, we have to devolve. Scale matters. Not fragmented, not ultra-local. It has to be big enough to shift the dial, particularly on the biggest cities outside of the southeast, because that's where the real productivity and the performance of the UK lies. Those places need to be given the institutions and the tools and the financing to change the trajectory of their local economies. The current deal-making devolution approach can't be a long-term template because the potential for horizontal coordination, misalignment between sectors, between places is so great. And the bellwether of this that I always point to is the Shared Prosperity Fund. It cannot be top-down or competitive. If it's big in scale, highly devolved and comprehensive, and really aimed at facilitating the devolution agenda, then it will be a strong indicator that we're moving in the right direction. But if it's top-down and largely competitive, basically a sectoral system with a few place-based twists on it, it'll be a clear indication we're going in the wrong direction. And then finally, the issue around coastal towns. It gets into the cities versus towns narrative or urban versus rural. The UK economy doesn't look like that. The gaps between big cities, small cities, large towns, small towns, and rural areas, those gaps in the UK are actually very narrow by international standards. It's really the core versus the periphery. That's the problem in the UK. And when I say the coastal towns is largely symbolic, I mean that in a positive sense, that these places are also left behind and they're aware of it. But that reflects a more general problem across many parts of the country, that the people there locally in these places know that they're left behind and they want to see that government is trying to do the right thing about them. And we need to learn the experiences, of course, in the coronavirus itself in terms of what's worked and what hasn't worked well. So I'll stop there and I'll pass back to Richard. I'll just get out of my screen.
Thank you very much, Philip. That was really interesting. A big sweep of themes and trends there. I was particularly struck by the idea that these are really long-term trends, but also by the mix or the interaction with what we're seeing now with questions about industry structure and the kind of work on antitrust and the big tech. I'm sort of thinking of the Diane Coyle and Jason Furman's report on the need for antitrust to take account of the way technology companies work. And also your points about concentration and monopolies, and a colleague of mine and Henry's, John Van Reenen's work on superstar firms. Both of those things, those kind of IO competition literatures, I hadn't really thought so hard about playing into the current UK regional debate, but they clearly do. So that was interesting. I'll now hand over to Henry, who's going to respond to those two presentations.
Thanks, Richard. Well, now I do have a slightly easier job. So where were we before the pandemic? Pronounced inequality within and between areas. I think we're all agreed on that. What's causing them, and will COVID change them? I mean, some of it's structural shift. So Helen mentioned skilled bias, technological change. Phil picked up on a bit on this. There's some stuff on automated. We know globalization is important. So, you know, what happens with Brexit and trade policy is going to matter. You know, it's hard to know what COVID's going to do with those, but, you know, we know that they're underlying drivers. I mean, I'm with her. I think the clustering of the more highly educated, higher skilled is a really big part in understanding our disparities. Phil, I know, has, you know, sort of said that mobility is not playing quite such a large role here. I think that's right, but of course, you know, we also have a very large intergenerational transmission component. So, you know, once you have these disparities, they can become pretty self-perpetuating without people having to move around very much. And I think that's probably important for understanding where we were. Now, in terms of COVID, you know, I think the really interesting thing there in the longer term, I'll come back to this in a minute, is what we think COVID might do to the way people think about the costs and benefits of agglomeration. I think that would be something that I'd like to pick up in the discussion. I think the other thing that both Phil and Helen flagged was that we know mobility is going to be less in the short run. And I think it's going to be interesting to think what we do about that, because mobility certainly plays a part in understanding the disparities that we see at the moment. I mean, the other thing that Phil picked up on is that we're ultra centralised in the UK. Put this down as both a cause of economic disparities and of discontent. I mean, I think this might have an important role to play in understanding where we are. But I mean, I'd also point out that, you know, I think a big part of the story, for example, when we look at Germany, is that Germany's education system just functions much better than ours. And that results in a higher level of overall productivity and narrower disparities than you get in a system which fails a large number of kids at the bottom. So, you know, I still think that just putting it all down to ultra centralized UK is a bit problematic. I mean, the thing where I think we're in absolute agreement is that I think having highly centralized hampers policy response on a number of dimensions. So let me just make a few comments on COVID. I mean, the immediate impact of the shock, Helen, for me, called it right here. You know, in those pictures she showed of, for example, the percentage furloughed being negatively correlated against weekly earnings, you know, I think everything we're getting suggests that the initially poorer places have been hit harder. I don't think that's surprising, given what we know about which sectors have been locked down and the ability to adjust from working from home. I mean, if you looked at those two things, you'd expect poorer households and communities to be hit hardest. I think, you know, it would be good if we could pick up in the discussion, you know, the extent to which we agree with that, because of course the problem is that UK, you know, subnational data is not very helpful for looking at what's going on in real time. So I think it would be helpful for people to see the extent of agreement on that. I also thought that something that it's probably interesting to pick up in the time we've got left for discussion is on the longer run effects of COVID. I mean, here sort of Philip and Helen both picked up on this with comments about mobility and home working. I have to say I liked Phil's point that commuting could actually, you know, the changes to commuting could actually benefit the hinterlands of our more prosperous cities. That's certainly what we've seen with changes in information communications technology up to now. And so I think this is something that we should pick up on. I mean, the other thing that I'm seeing a lot in the popular debate here is that somehow what we've seen will have massively changed the people's preferences for urban versus rural amenities. I have to say that this seems very much to be a story written by people over 40 who don't seem to care about getting out to the pub, etc. I think the reaction that we've seen from our young people suggests that they still very much value urban and rural amenities. I mean, the other thing I'd say on this is that I don't see that this can underpin long-run shifts in the aggregate population distribution, because we don't build any houses outside of our cities. I mean, we have appalling supply responses. So while there could be some pretty extreme price responses as people want to get away from our cities, there's hardly a huge amount of housing for them to move into, and I don't expect there to be much of a supply response. So it's hard to see that we're going to get large shifts in the population distribution, but I think it would be interesting to reflect on that. And then, you know, I won't pick out any of these for more comment now, but, you know, Helen talks about online spending and firm organisation, Philip about the capital markets and what's going on in the real estate markets. And I think that, you know, those would be interesting things to pick up when we get to the discussion. I should say, actually, my comment on where people might live, I think that what happens in commercial real estate markets could be very different. And then, you know, just briefly, 1 minute on the policy response. Has COVID strengthened the case for place-based policies? I don't know. I think it's strengthened some of the arguments, possibly weakened others, because, you know, we're going to need pretty strong redistribution between very unevenly hit areas. And, you know, we need to think about how we're going to manage that. I mean, the final thing I'd say, and this is a general observation, not a criticism of the two people that, you know, of our two speakers. I mean, what place-based responses would look like here in the British system? I think concrete policy suggestions are a little thin on the ground. And I hope that that's something we could pick up. I think it's pretty understandable that the initial policy response has been place blind in a highly centralized system. I actually think it's pretty understandable if the next phase of this policy response has to use the existing mechanisms that we've got in place, hence the arguments around free school meals, using the pupil premium to address the consequences for our disadvantaged students. I think there is scope for a more nuanced place-based response in the medium to long run, although I'm still, I have to say, despite spending a lot of time on it, slightly puzzled as to what that might look like. Anyhow, plenty to discuss. I'll hand back to Richard to lead us on that.
Thank you, Henry. Okay, so we've got 16 minutes left. So let's split that in between what's happening, sort of analysis type questions, and what's going to happen. And then in the last 8 minutes, I want to turn back to policy, as Henry said. And when we do that, I think we should split it between short-term policy, so people can start thinking about this, i.e. what can Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, do in the autumn budget? What can he do immediately, say, with tax and spending? Medium-term policies, which could be things like one of the speakers raised, education and curricula. You can do that, but that takes a while to change. And then long-term kind of institutional change, ideas like moving the House of Lords to York and so on, things that aren't going to help us with this crisis, but might help with the kind of regional decision-making. So get your thinking caps on, please, in those three buckets of policy. But in terms of what's actually happened, let's start with the really big question, which I think Henry touched on most, but perhaps Helen could lead us off with, because it really links to her question, is, has there been a fundamental shift in the way the UK economy is going to work because of changes in the costs and benefits of where you locate yourself? Because of teleworking, because of what we're now doing, Zoom. This is the sort of thing we'd have gone to the RAS in London to do. Has there been a fundamental shift in the way the economy is going to work? Helen?
I'm not sure whether it'll be fundamental, but I think some of the things we already knew were in the background, such as a move towards using more AI, more teleworking. These things were happening anyway, and I think this is going to accelerate that process. In terms of, you know, will people want to just work from home? Some might, but I think many won't. And I also think it's not necessarily the case that all employers will want those workers who could do that to do that. Certainly it's cheaper for the employer, but I don't think that productivity is necessarily going to be higher. So Henry mentioned what will change about the costs and benefits of agglomeration. One of the benefits we believe of, you know, co-locating together in a big city is face-to-face interaction, creativity. And if we think that those industries are still going to be at the fore of what the UK does, I think cities and offices are still going to have some relevance. They might be scaled down, they might not be used so much, but I do think that those things, I don't think those things are going to go away.
Henry?
Yeah, I mean, I think I tend to agree with that. I mean, Helen sort of put it there, you know, you need to think about the costs changing and the benefits changing. And actually, I pick up on Phil's comments. Actually, a big cost of, say, living in London or one of the larger cities is an hour and a half commute into the centre. And if your work is willing to turn around and say, well, actually, you know what, we're going to shift to 5 days in out of 10, you know, suddenly your commuting costs actually have dropped hugely. You know, now, I don't know that you suddenly switch to doing a 3-hour commute at that point versus thinking, well, actually, suddenly my 1-hour commute, which, let's face it, is, you know, zone 2 in central London, it actually, you know, makes central locations pretty attractive pretty soon on. I mean, I think lots of the debate that we're seeing on this also, I mean, one thing I'd say on the benefit side of it, I think that lots of the debate we're seeing is people talking about being able to work okay with their existing team. And I think that's probably right. You know, when you've had all of the face-to-face interactions that you need to develop trust and all of those sort of soft things that come from working together with people, then you really can switch to online for quite a period of time. But the dynamic impacts of that are awful. Once we start trying to onboard new team members, once we want people to be switching around, people exchanging ideas, etc., all those face-to-face benefits that actually, you know, Zoom and these other things aren't very good at substituting for. I think employers and individuals will be desperate to be back in the office.
That's really interesting. Having worked in a couple of policy institutions where you've got sort of 400 or something economists, you get to know people in your team very well, and you could do that on Zoom. But when you have to do something with somebody focused on a different part of the economy, it's more different. So I guess big firms might face that challenge. Philip, could you give us a little bit more what you think, because Henry picked up on it, it was really interesting, how you think the market angle is going to be affected. So you talk particularly about sort of yield spread. So is your idea that essentially firms who are more affected by or more involved in the provision of things that are dependent on co-location are essentially going to have riskier revenues, and because of that be riskier to finance and harder to find capital market funding?
Yes, exactly, Richard. That's the key point. So I used two cases, the two examples I gave, because I think I gave SMEs, locally based SMEs, and particularly the innovative ones, because these are very much a focal point of our industrial strategies, the way the government's thinking about local and regional development, and also the real estate markets, who are so important in terms, I'm thinking here in terms of commercial markets. Henry was right, kind of separate the residential from the commercial here. I'm thinking about the commercial markets, about redeveloping cities and regions, integrating, you know, modern forms of transportation system with high quality office facilities, the types of infrastructure for new entrepreneurial activities and all of that. The real estate markets are critical here, and they're very, very capital dependent. The sums involved are very large. The time lags are very long. And I think that these are two of the sectors which are going to be in the eye of the storm. And if you're thinking about cities outside of the core of the economy in terms of the broader southeast, that's the area which for me is the most important, because they're the ones which don't punch at their weight, and they represent a large proportion of the UK population. But by any international benchmarks, they don't punch at their weight. I mean, Henry was involved quite early on in the Manchester Independent Economic Review. Manchester's very much led the way in this kind of thinking and moving forward. A lot of the other city regions are copying. But two of the most important elements in terms of revitalizing their economies, I think, are basically going to find capital access and pricing just simply much more difficult in the next 5, 6, 7 years. And what we know is these capital shocks are very persistent. They don't disappear in a matter of months. They can take years to filter out of the system. I work with a team at the moment at the OECD, and you look at the data from the US, the capital shocks across US cities have taken 10 years to unwind, and they still haven't really disappeared. So I think this is going to make a lot of our levelling up agenda suddenly much more complicated in the medium and the long term. And when you add on top of these technical changes, occupational things that Henry and Helen are both referring to, I think it's another layer in the medium and the long term, which is going to make the levelling up agenda harder.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I want to turn to a couple of questions, because they're sort of analytical rather than which we should be able to answer, rather than sort of longer term policy questions. The first one is that we've had in. The first one is with regard to the coast. So are there going to be any benefits to the British tourist and coastal regions because of the crisis? In particular, I guess the question is, are people going to be more worried about going on holiday? So old coastal resorts might benefit. The second one related is, how does the UK compare to France? France also has a sort of one massive dominant city, but that city is, unlike ours, I guess, in a sort of less useful place, both in terms of its location. You know, the south of France and the east of France are kind of closer to the European economic hub, and also less favoured in terms of weather and other kind of lifestyle reasons. So firstly, the UK coast, less travel, potentially a focus on buying from more local companies because of concern about supply chain. Will that be a benefit? Helen?
I mean, you can see that over the next 4 weeks, the coast will probably pick up. Everyone is desperate to get out of their bedroom or study and get out to the coast. But it's difficult. It's very difficult to see a long run benefit here, because it's then going to be winter, you know, and this could be a very short-term blip. Also, I think it's going to take a long time for people's behavior to adjust. People are now used to being at home. They are used to, if they're even getting meals from outside, they're used to a takeaway. Going back and starting all this stuff again is actually going to take quite a long time. If you really want to do something, I don't know, radical with regard to the coast, investing in something like broadband, which would enable people to be able to live on the coast and take a much wider range of jobs than are currently available to them. What's currently available is essentially, you know, seasonal tourist related employment. That could be a big change. So investing in infrastructure, which would actually allow people to literally work from anywhere, could help the coast.
What about this question on France? Henry or Philip, have you got anything to say on that one?
A couple of thoughts, Richard. France is similar to the UK maybe 20 years ago, in the sense of France, Japan, UK would have been seen as the very centralized large economies. That's no longer true. France has gone through 2 waves of decentralization. Japan has gone through 2 as well. So we are now a lot more centralized than they are. That's just a reality. Also, your point about the geography is, of course, you know, 2/3 of the French, or more than half the French coastline, the French border areas is direct access into other countries, like the Iberian Peninsula, down to Italy, Switzerland, the Low Countries, and over to Germany. So a lot of their trade routes are very different. We're unusual in the UK that our dominant trade routes internally linked to international trade all go through the same location. It's just a matter of what we look like geographically. So we're different to France in that way. The other area that we're also different to France, which is important, is you know, we tend to have a view of France as being fairly dirigiste. So it's a surprise when people realize that in terms of the urban, regional, rural structure, France is actually the country that looks most like the United States, in the sense that its cities are much more productive. Big cities are more productive than smaller cities. Smaller cities are more productive than large towns. Large towns are more productive than small towns and rural areas. The UK doesn't look like that. Difficulty in the UK is you've got parts of the urban system which are very productive and more productive, big cities, places like London, Edinburgh, Bristol, and so on. But you've got lots of large cities in the UK which are not highly productive, some of which are no more productive than their own rural hinterlands. And many small towns and, not quite villages, but certainly small towns and rural areas in the UK are more productive than many urban areas. And that's a problem, because we have this narrative we borrowed from the US that it's all cities versus rural, or it's big cities versus small towns. That's simply not true in the UK case.
Okay, so we've now got 3 minutes left. We've kind of overrun, so we've got to do our policy part very quickly. But frankly, that's how policy works. So, and academic economists sometimes don't appreciate that. So let's now have from each of you, in maximum of 30 seconds, an idea for the short term, medium term, and long term. So, I mean, Helen, I don't know if you'd like to start. You've already given your short term one. It's a massive, and by short term, I mean it can be done this autumn by the Chancellor. And yours is a massive investment in broadband, because that means that a professional services provider could be based in a kind of rural coastal village or something. What about the medium term and long term?
So for the medium term and long term, if you want to level up, I think you've got to accept that there are trade-offs, and that London will, to some extent, have to level down relative to where it could have been had you placed all your investment in the southeast. So I think you've got to actually decide, I'm going to make a strategic decision. if I'm going to make some investment in innovation, in green technology or something like that, I'm going to place it in the north. I'm going to pick some locations where I really think we could get something going, get skilled workers to want to locate there, and eventually get private sector employers to want to locate there as well, and strategically invest in some other cities.
Great. Okay, so you, for one, would support moving the House of Lords to York, for example. That could also be done immediately, or at least announced immediately, and it would result in a lot of investment following it. Henry, short-term, medium-term, long-term, we're really running out of time.
Massive push for the pupil premium to deal with disadvantaged students.
Yep.
That's the long term. You know, that's the time bomb. And then actually it's the same old arguments. Invest in places where you can generate jobs, make sure that people across the broader geography can access them. And that's both investment in infrastructure to allow them to access them, but also to improve educational outcomes that mean that people struggle in the labour market.
Thank you very much. Now, Phil, we had a bit of problem with your line, so I'm going to summarise and I will ask the RES to record your policy solutions. It takes about 24 hours for this to go live on YouTube. There are 14 YouTube sessions, including competition policy, monetary policy, macro forecasting, finance. So I encourage people to go and look at those. The next webinar will be on the 6th of August, which is about universities, a crisis or not, chaired by Peter Dalton, with speakers Anton Muscatelli, David Blanchflower and Susan Dynarski. So thanks very much to all the speakers and see you next time.